You think you can successfully decipher the true meaning of that college-level text on a first try? Well, I highly doubt it. You think that same text can only be viewed through one lens? You're sorely mistaken. When analyzing text, there's a lot more to the process than meets the eye. It's a skill that takes time and extreme patience to perfect. However, one key tool that can be used for this very purpose is deconstructionism, or deconstruction if we're getting technical. As a general definition, deconstructionism acts as a critical outlook over the relationship between text and meaning. As a literary analytical tool, it serves one main purpose, quote, to look skeptically at the traditional confidence in stable literary meanings, which are seen as essences, end quote. Jacques Derrida, one of the most prolific and well-known philosophers of the 20th century, was this idea's main founder. He was born July 15, 1930, in El Biar, Algeria, which was French-governed at the time, and died October 8, 2004, in Paris, France. He was brought up and educated in French tradition and held an impressive academic resume, studying and teaching at prestigious French institutions, including École Normale Supérieure and Sorbonne. Instead of following the various philosophical movements that came before him, including phenomenology, existentialism, and structuralism, he decided to distance himself from these and developed his own. By coming up with deconstructionism, Derrida developed an in-depth critique of Western philosophy as a whole, sparking inspiration all throughout the intellectual world in the late 20th century. Although it was said to have been controversial, the concept became a huge success, seeing as it had an influence on many different fields at the time, including art, politics, and literature. This success shot Derrida to superstar status. Not only were many books and articles inspired by and written based off his way of thinking, he also had TV programs and films dedicated to him, as well as hundreds of people coming to his lectures. If philosophy had rock stars, this guy was one of them. Now, Derrida may have been the founder of deconstructionism, but he did not develop it on his own. He had much help from an impressive list of academic counterparts from Yale University. This list included prominent American literary critics and theorists, Paul DeMann, Jeffrey Hartman, and J. Hillis Miller, who is still alive today. As a result of the work of Derrida and his colleagues, deconstructionism came to fruition in the mid-1960s and remained prominent in academia through the 1980s. By using it, one was able to expose and undermine binary oppositions, including presence and absence, and speech and writing, that support society's primary ways of thinking. As stated before, although the idea was revolutionary, these men were still met with criticisms. Some critics have called deconstruction a form of nihilism, claiming it to be one of the main contributors to the ruining of Western scientific and ethical values. In turn, some conservative and libertarian writers use this as an example to support their claims of what is wrong with modern academia. Regardless, more people seem to have found deconstructionism useful rather than bad.
Multiple meanings. If I said to somebody, "You look really nice today. What did you do different?" I am trying to give a person a compliment. However, to that person, they may think of it as not a compliment, but an insult. For example, they might reply with, "What are you talking about? I didn't do anything. I look good every day." That is an example of multiple meaning. Another example would be when you tell your parents over the phone that you love them just before you hang up. You may mean it as a sign and showing that you really care about them. However, If the phrase gets used too often, you suddenly start to use it as a way of simply saying goodbye and hang up the phone. Therefore, that phrase has suddenly lost its meaning. Binary oppositions. Binaries are two contradicting words that are relative to one another. If you were raised in a dark place with no light, you wouldn't know what light is. If you were raised in a place that was always warm and hot, you probably wouldn't know what the cold is. They are still relative to one another, though. If the world were good all the time, we wouldn't know what it meant to be bad. And vice versa. If the world were bad, we wouldn't know what it really meant to be good. What would a superhero be without a villain? Or vice versa, what would a villain be without the superhero?
I don't want to kill you. What would I do without you? Go back to ripping off mob dealers? No, you complete me.
Free floating signifiers. If I say the word coat, which coat comes to your mind? Is it green? Is it yellow? Is it purple? What's the material made out of? How old is it? Even though I can continue to add words to simplify it down, narrowing it to one type of coat, to your mind as opposed to mine or another's, it is never going to be exactly the one that was thought of. This is important to understand because the signified is what the jacket or the coat or the object really is. The signifiers is what you think it looks like or what it could be to your mind. Derrida, who was mentioned earlier in the presentation, had invented a word known as difference. Difference is exactly like difference except with an A instead of the E. He did this to prove a point. He did this because whether it's spelled with the E or the A, in French it's going to sound exactly the same, différence. Therefore, when he's speaking in French, the French will not know which word he is saying. Derrida's point and reason for making up this word is to show that there is a gap between the signifier and the signified. Because you would never be able to tell which word he was saying, it would keep a distance and difference between the signifier and the signified.
When we first start a reading of a text through the lens of deconstruction, there are some philosophical assumptions that we take into account. The first assumption is that the work is already deconstructed, and by this I mean not that it is broken down into its individual parts, but rather carries with it so much accumulated meaning through the use of language that it can't possibly convey a center intent given to us by the author. In short, the medium of language effective to convey the author's intent in the first place. The second assumption that we bring to a text is that it is ongoing, fertile with contradictions and questions alike. So with this, we start our readings with questions such as, what are the different meanings that are produced by a text language? How does the narrative of the text build meaning, and what language contradicts that narrative? What is the heart or center of the text, and how can we see this foundation in a different way to disprove its stability? Now that we know what questions to ask, we can approach our piece and perform a close reading. A deconstructionist's interpretation usually follows the process called a double reading, where in a short definition, you set up a text to seem a certain way, and then you disprove that seemingly meaningful interpretation through the contradictions in language. The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams. While interpreting, we closely read the work centering on language and what that language means. The Red Wheelbarrow is structured as a sentence broken up into 4 couplets. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater, besides the white chickens. When we focus on the language of the poem, we zoom in and rephrase the actual words to an accumulated amount of situations, objects, ideas, or people have obtained a dependence on a tool that is saturated in nature and in an approximate distance to poultry. Although this is good, we can break down the words into some more of a skeleton phrase that becomes so much depends on a tool in a specific situation. Looking at this simple phrase, we can see that Williams is suggesting that the wheelbarrow has a lot that depends on it, and he might be literally just saying that this wheelbarrow is relevant in our reality. Although we can take this poem to be a literal ode to a wheelbarrow, we can also see that the wheelbarrow is unused, sitting stagnant, while chickens live freely without it. So can't we also say that he might be being sarcastic? He might be just saying, oh yeah, this wheelbarrow is really useful. Things like that. He might be just saying that it's really useful, pointing out that the chickens are just sitting there plucking behind it. So in the long run, we don't know what Williams is saying. There is meaning in his sarcasm in this sentence, and there is meaning in his rhetorical, literal sense that there is a lot of dependence on this wheelbarrow. Therefore, we have done a deconstructionist reading on this. We have found that this can have many meanings, and so that there is ultimately almost a breakdown of ultimate meaning.
Patrick here. I will be talking about the political implications of deconstruction. Let's go back into what deconstruction is really quick. And for assistance, I will be using my friend Tico as an example of how we can deconstruct something to be more than what it is at first glance. This is a picture of Tico, who is a canine unit. Based on this alone, we might infer that I will be speaking about police dogs. But in reality, I could possibly be talking about any number of things, like Tico's personal story, dogs and drug enforcement, or the impact on working dogs. This meaning is supplied both by my introduction of Tico, Tico's image, and your interpretation of my intro, and Tico's presence in the slide. But is there more to Tico? Deconstruction asks us to delve deeper. For instance, applied through a lens of varying perspective, we can talk about Tico in terms of Tico's gender. Is Tico a male or female? We can ask, what is Tico's purpose? To train other canines, perform dangerous field work, or breed new generation of police dogs? As a canine unit, does Tico have protective rights? If Tico is too old or injured, or possibly killed, what becomes of Tico? Deconstruction challenges us to see Tico in as many ways possible. Deconstruction is a method anyone can apply to anything to see beyond the implied, the simplified, or even the binary, thereby assigning more than one signifier to the signified. So, to tackle the political implications, we must understand it is more than the proverbial he said or she said, or simply the obvious. Elijah previously talked about some of the questions we should ask when we approach a text from a deconstructionist perspective, And he also gave us an example of how a literary text can be broken down deconstructively. To help us understand what implications this can have politically, the Oxford Dictionary defines politics as the activities associated with the governance of a country or area, especially the debate between parties having power. Now that we have tackled something small like Tico, let's move on to something bigger, like imperialism, for example. From the 18th century until the 20th century, early Africa was subject to colonization. Countries from all over Europe used their militaries and global economies to subdue parts of the African continent. Now, when these European countries colonized Africa, they brought things like transportation, the train, infrastructure in the form of schools and centralized governments. The telegraph allowed communication from Cape Town, South Africa, all the way to Cairo, Egypt. Western medicine practiced in hospitals combated the tide of malaria, yellow fever, smallpox, and polio. Finally, modern tools like cement allowed for easier acquisition of natural resources, which replaced more traditional practices like fire that relied on burning tons of wood to crack ores, thereby rendering already sparse tree landscapes virtually barren. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, that's one way to look at imperialism, and this but is the essence of deconstruction. What else is there? Tribal leaders were not recognized by colonial governments, so the natives lost their voice. And the dress of one tribe that reflected the great pride and rich cultural heritage from another was often challenged by Western attire that was no different in France than it was in England or Italy. And while there were schools that taught Western values, tribal ones were ignored, and conscientious Africans rarely were permitted entry into university. In conclusion, if we were to apply, say, post-colonial and race studies, or historicism and cultural studies towards an analysis of imperialism, we merely create a number of binary arguments challenging a status quo. Deconstruction is all about asking what else exists beyond the binary. It is the essential but that occurs at the end of every sentence or statement. Using the deconstruction method, therefore, has a lot of political implications, as it can be applied in any situation. One can, for instance, go further into imperial studies by reevaluating all Western values, dialectics, metaphysical traditions, cultural habits, identities, laws, economics, and even politics, and breaking them down into additional signifiers. Anyway, this is the end of my presentation, and I hope this helped you understand the political implications of deconstruction.